William Afton, a character who shaped the FNAF franchise into what it is now. Initially known as the Purple Guy or Purple Man, an unknown figure who murdered the children who possessed the animatronics, William was eventually given a name, a voice, a face, and much more. Turning from a dark shadow in the corner of Freddy's into something else. And that something else is about a half dozen rabbits. Yes, Afton has gone through a lot of changes over the FNAF series. I regret to say, most for the worst, as the current Afton is a far cry from the one we were once introduced to. Today we are going to look at the downfall of Afton. How he was crafted as a faceless murderer, became a supervillain, and then became an embarrassment. Quick note, but I know plenty of people are going to disagree with me, and that is totally fine. Just hear me out and then you'll understand why I feel the way I do. Let's begin. In FNAF 1 and 2, very little was known about the Purple Man. He simply doesn't exist in the first game. That is, we know about his murders, how he lured the children while wearing a suit, but we do not have a name or any descriptors. Not until the mini-games in FNAF 2, when we see a purple-skinned man attack a crying child outside of a restaurant, be present amongst a room of bodies, and attack Freddy when the puppet is leading him around. We only get the vaguest of characterizations. We know the murderer is at least somewhat cunning, or knows how to trick the animatronics, and that he has killed more children than originally expected. But not much else. Not until FNAF 3, when we finally see the murderer for ourselves, but he isn't quite what he used to be. As shown in the mini-games, the Purple Man was confronted by the ghosts of his victims and hid away in his suit, where he suffered a spring lock failure and was fused to it. And that is the form that we see. No longer human, the murderer is now known as Springtrap, and he fits the name well. He is an intimidating animatronic, much more rotten and decayed than any before him, hunting you down in the halls of a haunted horror attraction. He does not speak, silently stalking you, but you can occasionally hear him moan and groan. There was a time when fans analyzed the audio of his moaning and believed they could hear the words "help me." I'm not sure if that's true or not, but the fact that people thought they could hear a human inside of the machine was effectively disturbing. As were the secret screens where you could see his corpse inside of the suit. One thing about Springtrap that was quite impressive at the time and still, in retrospect, was a pretty cool detail. Springtrap walked, hid, and moved like a human in a suit. He stalked the halls like a person would, and that set against his garish form created a spooky effect. Yes, there was quite a bit about Springtrap that was good, and this is part of the reason why he was so popular. Putting a face on the Purple Guy was already a tall order to fill with all the fan interpretations coming out. It seemed like even in this other form, the response to Springtrap was overwhelmingly positive. I can't very well say that ever happened again. It was after this point that Afton started his decline. If I can sum up how bafflingly far he fell, later games and books try to retrospectively imply that this, William getting spring-locked, was on purpose to fulfill his great plan of immortality. But that's not what we're talking about now. In fact, I'd rather not ever talk about that. Arguably the next version of Afton was in Sister Location. He did not appear, but this was where the Purple Guy suddenly had a backstory, a voice, and an evil British accent. We also were introduced to his daughter and tipped off that the main character of FNAF 1 was his son. Now, William's name was actually revealed in the book version, but I do not want to talk about the book version in this video. So, where do we go next? Well, Sister Location's Halloween update suggested that Michael was going after William, as well as using some confusing telegraphing that brought on the mic trap theory that I will go off on one day. That leads into Pizzeria Simulator and Afton's new design. And it is bad. Scraptrap is supposed to be a more decayed form of Springtrap, even though he has significant changes from him. He no longer looks like a spring lock suit, now being much more skinny. His face, with its lumpiness, is supposed to look skeletal but instead looks pretty goofy. Speaking of skeletons, he now is sporting an excessive amount of bones that the last version of him did not have. Scraptrap is basically what happens when you try to make Springtrap scarier but don't understand what it is that makes Springtrap scary. Since there are no cameras and no animations beyond the jump scares, that movement factor was also taken away. This is the scariest Scraptrap gets. But in my opinion, and I'm pretty certain I'm one of the only people with this opinion, the worst part about Scraptrap is his dialogue. Oh dear God, it is bad. Scraptrap lets out lines that would have fit seamlessly into Shadow the Hedgehog. This also began the trait of I'm doing something stupid because it's part of my big plan thing. This was the game where Afton became Lame. The reception to Scraptrap was rather lukewarm. From what I saw in the community at the time, his redesign was met with either indifference or disappointment. I'm sure someone thought this design was better, but I didn't see anyone who did. And I can't exactly say they're wrong because opinions are subjective. All I can say is that this didn't do it for me. But that's okay since this is the game where we say goodbye to Afton, right? His business partner sets fire to them all and the history of Freddy's comes to an end, as does the lives of most of our cast. Well, everyone except Afton, because he comes back again. Afton's next iteration is a peculiar one that I am torn on. In Help Wanted, we are introduced to an unlikely virus creeping through the system. It is William in yet another rabbit suit. And before you say it's just a virus replicating William, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, looks like a duck, it's probably not a goose. It's highly suggested to be some version of Afton, who has gone from person, to animatronic, to virus that can infect both people and machines. Even if it isn't actually William, it is filling the exact same role. Same motives, same personality. While I find the concept of Glitchtrap rather convoluted and have pretty much been burned out on rabbits. Get it? I do feel like there were some things about Glitchtrap that were a positive. With him being silent again, a lot of Glitchtrap's character came through his motions and movements, and they certainly were uncomfortable and human-like. Plus Glitchtrap was different enough from the past versions of Afton that he felt unique. Well, it lasted for one game. Now, you might have thought that Vanny, possessed by Glitchtrap, is the next version of Afton, but no. Instead it was decided that the trap line would continue with one last version of him. Well, here it is. While Burntrap looks somewhat better than Scraptrap, the reception might have been even worse, and there's a few reasons for this. In fact, it had little to do with his design. Save that he looked so much like a shriveled up piece of jerky that people started referring to him as Peepaw Afton, making this the first Afton version that is known more as a meme than a villain. No, the problem with Burntrap is how he is in the game. He appears in the last few minutes with little build-up, barely does anything, and then is immediately killed with the knowledge that he's going to come back again. Less like a threat and more like an exasperated sigh. Not to mention that this and the last segment retroactively affected Pizzeria Simulator's finale in quite a negative way. I'll go into that at a separate time, but there were plenty of people who thought it was a slap in the face. I'll confess that I was not fond of Pizzeria Simulator and didn't love the ending. That being said, I agree that this game's needless retroactive tweaking of it is a mistake and does negatively affect that and this game. While Burntrap is voiceless, cut dialogue reveals that he was just as edgy as he was in PS Another Lamb for the Slaughter, I'm gonna burn you all, I like killing kids, all that sorts of stuff. There is also very little logic around Burntrap. Why is he in one of the glam rock endos? Well, Some people believe that Glamrock Bonnie was destroyed and Vanny used his pieces to rebuild Burntrap. This could be likely, but there is pretty much nothing in the game that confirms or directly suggests this beyond Bonnie just not being there. There's nothing to explain Burntrap coming back. There's no dialogue between him and Vanny. Vanny never mentions him, he never mentions Vanny, the two are in separate locations. How did a recharge station get down here? Did Vanny bring it here? The reason this matters so much is that you cannot have an effective payoff without the build-up, and most people going in blind were just like, oh, there's Afton, okay. I'm sure this was a time constraint thing. Cutscenes from the trailer didn't make it into the game and there was a second half of the boss fight that was cut. That's an explanation, not an excuse. Too long didn't read, Burntrap kind of blew it. Now, separately these many forms of Afton don't seem to matter. But when lined up together and with the knowledge that Afton is both the main antagonist and practically the main character, you can see where it might all affect the franchise. It doesn't sound too bad until you realize that this intimidating figure became this shameless display. I said I wouldn't recount the books, but they had a very similar pattern to this. In the first book he is true to the games, in the second he's Springtrap. In the third he's out of Springtrap and now reveals that his personality in the last two books was a lie and he's actually a mad scientist studying immortality and all that jazz. Then in the spin-off books he appears as an amalgam and dies. I think I figured out what the biggest downfall of William Afton's was, and I think it involves the amount of popularity the character had back during the first few games. William Afton was a draw of some sort. People came up with their own popular headcanons and initially showed an increased interest in finding out more about the man behind the suit. And to capitalize on that, FNAF veered hard. William Afton couldn't just be a murderer. He had to be a mad scientist, he had to be Jason Voorhees and Freddy from Nightmare on Elm Street. He had to be the ultimate everything. Every new version of him was an attempt to outdo the old one. More and more of the lore hints were about him. More of the stories were about him. Every character was in some way related to him. He was the Alpha and Omega and all in between. But there was one thing William could never achieve after that first iteration. That mystery, that scare factor, that curiosity. We now know William front, back and center, and it doesn't matter how many times the series assures us that he's the smartest, most evil thing in it. We've seen too much. We know too much. We've been oversaturated. Ironically, like the oversaturation that FNAF was facing around the time that this change went into effect. The more we saw William's personality, the more it turned into a goofy caricature. His newest iteration was absolutely uninspired, only there as though depicted by a corporate mandate. Like someone's pet character that needed to be shafted in. The realistic portrayal of a murderer, something that is timelessly scary, was tossed aside in order to make him a Play-Doh villain. Afton was never good enough, so he is continually changed into something new, but it's just making him worse. And while you think that might make an intimidating villain, there's a reason why sequels upon remakes of horror movies are never as good as initial iterations. Eventually there comes a point where someone becomes so outrageous that it loses its own credibility. I was okay with the idea of Glitchtrap, to an extent, but I think that by now the series should have started trying to move on to something, anything else. In a future video I might go further into the book versions of William Afton, if only because they're so bafflingly insane. God help me. I will also make a video on what I think should have been the real final villain in Security Breach and Into Ruin. My final thoughts are this: I think that Springtrap was a fine villain and I don't think it would have been impossible to bring Afton back maybe just once and have it work. But I don't think hinging the entire franchise on one character was a good idea. If anything, it strangled the character. I also absolutely do not think Burntrap should have existed. If there was not enough time to have him fully implemented, then he should have been scrapped and more time should have been put towards Vanny and the rest of the game. Burntrap could have returned in a future game, but now you will never be able to do over his introduction in Security Breach. Heck, Ruin could have been about someone going under the now abandoned Pizzaplex, maybe the freed Vanessa in the good ending, and confronting Burntrap. We know that Vanessa had cut lines and gameplay, so that could have been an appropriate epilogue. It would have given more time to build up to and reveal Burntrap. But that's not what happened. Instead we got Peepaw Afton. Also, here's a question. If Glitchtrap is an unintended virus that got into the system and not only invaded the games but infected the Pizzaplex, as suggested by the numerous emails, messages, and therapist messages talking about the corruptions, hacks, and attempts to stop the virus overtaking the system, then why does he have his own arcade cabinet?